Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this public lecture by Rohini Pande. First of all, I would like to welcome everybody, but also special thanks to Rohini Lall here and to the trustees of the Memorial Sanjaya Lall Fund. And we are privileged enough that thanks to the generosity of the fund, we can host distinguished speakers like, for example, Rohini this year. So a warm welcome, of course, special welcome to Rohini. So Rohini is Henry Heinz II Professor of Economics at Yale and also Director of the Economics Growth Center at Yale. She doesn't need much of an introduction, especially with this audience. She's globally recognized as an expert in development economics and political economy. Her research explores how institutions shape economic, political, and environmental advantage in low and middle-income countries. And precisely this day, she will talk about regulating carbon emissions in those state capacity settings. So, Rohini, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Shall we give one full hour to Rohini and then about 20 minutes Q&A? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming here. Thank you to the Lall family for just a very warm welcome they've given me here and to the department. It's a real pleasure to be back here in this department. So what I want to do today is talk about what I think probably many people in the room will agree is a big issue facing the world, which is really what do we do about the ever-rising carbon emissions. So if you go back to 2015 to the Paris Agreement, at that point, kind of on the basis of the IPCC recommendation, there was a broad agreement that if you wanted to keep the temperatures from rising to, at that point, there was some hope about 1.5. I think now it's 2 degrees centigrade that people tend to believe may be feasible. We needed to have very significant reductions in emissions. By some estimates, you needed reductions from current levels of emissions by 43% by 2030. But the number that people would always talk about is that you wanted the world to be net zero by 2050. Since then, we've seen some amount of progress. Over 140 countries have put forward targets of when they want to be net zero by. Many fewer countries have converted these targets into either pledges or policies. And we know that all of these actions are much less likely to happen in low-income countries. Time when we see that the United States has both announced that it will withdraw from the Paris Agreement for sure by January 2026, and is probably going to roll back most of its regulations on tailpipe emissions and on climate more broadly, it's good to remember that this tracker that looked pessimistic is probably going to look even worse. So this the climate action tracker, which every 4 or 5 months reminds us about how poorly we're doing. You can see the rise in global greenhouse gas emissions. The blue line at the top is where you are on the base, dark blue line is where you're on the basis of current policies and actions, which is basically stabilizing. And as I said, that'll probably go up once taking into account the US withdrawals. If you take more seriously the pledges and targets, which haven't yet been translated into actions, you see some downward shift, but there's a long gap between that and where you want to be in terms of a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030. And one important reason for that is even though you've had 140 countries sign these announced targets, there is no reason for a net zero target of a country to have anything to do with the global target. And that's actually a point I'll come back to a couple of times, is that we focused a lot on kind of individual firm or country targets, while knowing but not fully recognizing the fact that what you really care about is how all of this adds up to the global target. Now, at the same time as the Paris Agreement put forward the hope for net zero by 2050, it also recognized the fact that you needed to account for differential responsibility. And so it states that net zero should be achieved on the basis of equity and in the context of efforts to eradicate poverty. And a very simple fact, and Michael Greenstone kind of put up this graph in his AEA lectures last year, is that there's basically a one-to-one correlation right now across countries in increasing GDP and increasing energy consumption. And as you can see in the next panel, energy consumption right now we see is fossil fuel based, which raises emissions. And the prices of fossil fuels are not going up. So there is no reason to expect fossil fuel based growth to in itself become more expensive. So the first question you could ask is that given that we believe in some notions of, climate justice or the fact that low-income countries should not be asked to do more, can we do better by just scaling up the policies that rich countries have put in place? So it's certainly the case that today we see emission policies that cover roughly a quarter of global emissions. While carbon pricing remains controversial, what has taken off recently is cap and trade markets, or what I'll call compliance markets through this talk, which is that you announce a total emissions cap on emissions from a certain set of sectors, and countries have to hold, firms or whoever the groups who are targeted by it have to hold enough permits for the emissions they emit. Much of these policies, as much the domestic emissions, are coming from G20 countries, and we do see some promising signs. So Brazil and Turkey and India are all moving towards carbon markets at this point. But there are two, I think, big concerns. One that I've alluded to already is geopolitics. It seems to be going somewhat the wrong direction right now. And also industrial competitiveness concerns are likely to limit how much we expect rich countries to scale this up. But what I want to focus on today really mostly is that what a focus on just kind of scaling up rich country policies does, it fails to leverage gains that you can get from trade across countries, especially if those are potentially avoided emissions from nature-based projects. So just to remind you, I think there's been a lot of discussion about energy-intensive growth, but actually what we see in a lot of low-income countries in the process of development is deforestation. And today, tropical deforestation emits annually roughly 4 times as much as the aviation and shipping sectors combined, which are some of the sectors we hear the most about in discussions of where we should reduce emissions. I think this graph makes this point quite clearly. So what this has is it shows against income what the predicted decline in forests are. And the way the graph was computed is basically looked across the forests on the borders of every two countries. So for instance, take North Korea and South Korea. You look at the difference in forests between those two at the border, and you say, well, South Korea is so much richer. That tells me something about how much GDP is correlated with deforestation. And certainly, I think in rich countries, we no longer see those levels of deforestation. If anything, we often see reforestation or afforestation. But in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, some parts of Latin America, we continue to see very high levels of deforestation right now.
What is VCF?
Sorry?
What is VCF?
It's the predicted cover of forest cover. And so just to give you, just summarize the numbers, right now annual deforestation accounts for it's a large border because all of these things are estimated with a lot of error, between 12 to 20% of annual carbon dioxide emissions. Roughly 10 million hectares of land are annually deforested. If you want to think of this in terms of countries, this is roughly the size of South Korea. And it's mainly done for unproductive agricultural activities and livestock like cattle rearing in the Amazon is a big reason for it. So really the basis of the talk starts from the point that we know that a ton of greenhouse gas emissions raises global emissions irrespective of where it happens. In a world which we live in today, where we have limited funding, if you want to achieve the least possible climate damage, you want to remove the cheapest to remove damages first. It's going to be much cheaper in the short run. And so I'm going to emphasize this a couple of times, talking about what we need to do first in the short run, not to take away from things you want to do in the medium or long run. You want to avoid the global south ecosystem destruction, and that's going to be much cheaper than in the short run, trying to immediately force, probably unsuccessfully, a lot of cutting of productive global north companies' emissions. I should say at the same time, as I'm going to focus a lot on talking about deforestation, I will also acknowledge that this is a large part of a lot of voluntary carbon markets, that afforestation and reforestation also reduce emissions. But if you think more broadly, When you protect mature existing forests, you're going to get large carbon storage, not just reductions in emissions, and biodiversity benefits, which are not going to be there from reforestation. And as we'll see, the problem of trying to prevent deforestation through markets is actually much harder than the problem of just trying to pay for reforestation or afforestation. But I think at the same time, it's important that we think about how we address it, because in the short run, that's going to be critical. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about, I think, an opportunity that exists, which is to think about how do we reform, and I'll describe this in some detail, the voluntary carbon market, possibly in the context of what's going on right now under the COP framework of the UN, which is Article 6.4, which also I'll describe right now, is to reform it from not being something that is a bilateral trade between a project developer and someone who buys it, but rather to think about how this can be part of a carbon market, and a carbon market that is designed in a way so that you can have in net transfers from the global north to global south. So this will be a form of climate financing that will go to the global south, and that this process is going to be supported by an independent measurement reporting verification body. And I'm going to go into the details of it quite a lot, but just to give you a sense of kind of where I want to suggest we want to get to. And certainly in a lot of ways, this is, a North Star. We won't get to this today or tomorrow, but I think if we have to try to address the big problems, we need to kind of have our eye on what the ultimate prize is. And I'm going to argue a lot of the smaller solutions we are seeing in trying to just make small measurement solutions are not going to get you there. So just in terms of the structure of the talk, I want to start by describing to you how the voluntary carbon market looks like right now and why it's failing very badly. I want to then talk about the proposal. And then I think the third part is really the part that comes to the research, which is to say that I think one of the things that economists can be good at, but actually have not engaged a lot in this conversation with, is how do you actually design the implementation of such a market? I mean, Esther has often talked about these issues as thinking about the plumbing of governance systems. And I think this is a space right now we've had a lot of policy discussions. We have a lot of lawyers discussing this at COPs. We've actually had relatively little engagement on market design in carbon. And I think this is a place where we could benefit from it. Let me start by talking a little bit about what the current status of voluntary carbon markets is. And before doing that, there'll be a few boring slides, not too many, just to fix some ideas. I'm going to be talking often about what is traded. So it's useful to distinguish between two things. In a compliance market or cap and trade market, you're going to cap emissions overall. So you're going to have an overall cap on how many emissions there can be. Each business, can emit, but if it's going to be too close to the cap, it's going to have to pay a very high price for it because it's taking up most of the emission space available to the group of industries. And so that's going to be the marketable permit. If I want to emit one more metric of CO2, and the world is very close to its cap, I have to pay a lot of money for that extra permit. In contrast, in the voluntary carbon market, what we often talk about is offset credits. These are also supposed to capture the same thing, which is 1 metric ton of CO2, but it's actually not something that is at all disciplined by the ceiling of any kind of emission cap. Rather, what it says is, I want to buy 1 metric ton of emission to offset my flight. You're going to sell it to me at some price, and it's a trade between Barbara and me. It has nothing to do with the overall emissions cap that the world is trying to go towards. And that means that it doesn't necessarily need to go up as I buy more and more of it. And so we're going to think about, I think, 3 different ways in which implementation can happen. So the first one is the one that corresponds to the permit credits. The most well-known example of it is the EU ETS scheme. There's also the UK emissions trading scheme. California has one. That's the regulated compliance market. The voluntary carbon market is the one we enter when you want to offset your flight, among other things. And then I'd say the newest player on the table is that in COP29, there was an agreement in Baku that you're going to implement a centralized carbon market mechanism, which will be overseen by the UN under the Paris Agreement. And those are the rules of which are currently being described. Just to remind you, these are some examples of how you have seen offsets. You can see here, I came here from the US. My flight was, optimistically 9, but I put it at 10 to 12 hours. And you can see it's very cheap if you take the rates going in the market for me to offset the emissions of my flight. And you see that, for instance, when you buy a flight ticket, they'll often tell you want to offset your flight. And this in itself can tell you there's probably something wrong with this market. We've all heard about discussions of the social cost of carbon. This doesn't sound like the kind of numbers we hear in that discussion. But, this is what the carbon offset. So who are the players in the carbon offset market? I'll just go through them briefly. There are 4 sets. So you have first the buyers. So it could be, someone like Delta who buys a set of offsets and then maybe sells them on to me as the customer, or just offsets its emissions. So when companies say they want to turn net zero by a certain year, this is largely what they're doing. They are looking to buy offsets to manage their own net zero goal. The other side of the market is who's selling. These are developers. These are typically not farmers per se, but they've been aggregated up into a group. So for instance, Red Plus is the set of forest project developers often. So, you'll have something like the Infinite Earth will go and tell a set of Kenyan farmers, why don't you commit to not cutting trees for 30 years, and then they are going to kind of sell that bundle on this market. And there are many different players. It's not just forest right now, it could be energy generation and so on. But how does the market work? So the market doesn't work by Delta going to a forest project. Rather, Delta will go to a broker, places like South Pole or others, and say, I want to buy. I want to buy emissions, and can you tell me what I can buy? Now, the broker will give you a price and sell to you. But how do you know you're not double counting? How do you know that this broker is not selling it to everyone? This is not regulated by the government in any way. So a set of again, private sector regulators have come up, which are known as registries. I think the 2 best known ones are VERA, the Verified Carbon Standard, and the Golden Standard. And their job is supposed to be to track and verify offsets. And we'll come to some of the issues with them, but they are supposed to basically provide the gold standard against which you then the brokers can sell. So what happened in this market? So this market started growing in after around 2010, and it really took off just in 2021 or so. And there was a lot of discussion that if this continues like this, it's still a small market. It was only $2 billion in transactions, but this is, if you just took that line and extrapolated it, you think that this will become a very big player. That didn't happen. And what happened instead? So again, one last piece of terminology before I tell you what happened to this market. A key part of buying an offset, when I buy an offset, I would like to believe that there's a farmer who would have cut a tree, but is now not cutting the tree because I have paid him not to cut the tree. And in that sense, my payment needs to be additional. It needs to make someone undertake an activity that they would not have otherwise. In this case, the emissions reductions. There was a study in Science magazine in 2023 that highlighted that most often when I'm actually paying a farmer who had no intention of cutting his trees. So it was completely non-additional. And this was a problem that was then widely reported by the mainstream media. And what's important to notice is that as development economists, we often think about mistargeting or things not working out. So we often talk about you have a subsidy and the cheap food doesn't go to the poor household, goes to rich household. That's bad, but it's not as bad as actually non-additionality, because when I buy an offset that I believe it works, I actually take an extra flight. Right. And so I'm actually in net, you're actually increasing the emissions in the atmosphere because I believe that this is additional, and on the basis of it, I'm undertaking activities. This market is not just not functioning, it may actually be making the problem worse if it's going to continue to exist. Now, why does this problem arise? A lot of it has to do with institutional forms of how these measurement, reporting, and verification system work. And what they build on, and I'll come to an example from that in a minute, is actually going back to the Kyoto Protocol, when there was the clean development mechanism, under which it was identified that how will we decide how much additionality there is in a project. And they chose to take a very bottom-up approach, where you essentially have baseline verifiers who are typically paid for by project developers, who will identify what are the reductions involved. And typically what this means is I have to choose as the verifier what counterfactual to go with. So I will decide if it hadn't been for this money, this is how much the price, this is how much deforestation would have taken place. And actually my payments as a verifier are based on showing that there is additionality. So that's one clear reason why you would have problems in incentives. Then those who are selecting the projects often have multiple objectives, not all of which, and I'll give you an example in a minute, which are going to exhibit additionality. And then finally, even after if the project was potentially additional when you started, this is a project possibly taking place in the DRC. The person who's bought it is sitting in the US. How are they going to monitor? They have to rely on this DRC state or this project verifier to make sure that actually the money reaches the farmer and then they don't cut it, or if they cut it, they face a very high penalty. That's a hard thing to ensure. And it's particularly hard thing to ensure when you don't really see as the person buying the product what happened. So in that sense, it's different from a market for lemons for, say, used cars, because you get a used car, you know it doesn't work. Here, actually, I don't have any way of really knowing whether or not it works. And so there's been in the end, it seemed that a lot of the problems of non-additionality were coming up because of how these institutions had been designed. So just to give you one very, I think, nice example, nice or not nice example, depending how you think about it, of how this happened, it is a very nice study based on wind projects in India. So under the when India was part of the Clean Development Mechanism and the Kyoto Protocol, a lot of what it did was invest in wind projects and ask for subsidies for these wind projects, saying that they were additional. So if you look at here from 1995 onwards, the Kyoto Protocol came into place, project registration began in 2000. And so what this paper did, it measured all the wind projects in India after that. And there are two kinds of them. There are ones that came under the CDM, so you got subsidized, and those that did not come under it. And they did a very simple exercise. They said if you were built with a subsidy, but you were better situated in terms of wind and closest to the grid than the nearest plant that was built without a subsidy, then you were likely non-additional. Because the plant that actually has much worse conditions than you was built without the subsidy and shown to be profitable. And they show that basically roughly half of these farms were non-additional. So that's a very nice exercise. But I think what's nicer is they actually think about why did this happen. So one of the points they make that India was trying to do two things as the government. It was trying to get money from CDM. It also had to meet its sustainable development goals under another UN program. And under that, having more wind energy was good. So you wanted to have a lot of large wind projects because that was actually going to show up as making you look high on SDG. So they themselves had incentives to not necessarily shoot down non-additional projects. Third-party verifiers just had the problem. They were paid by projects. They needed to do it. And then finally, they showed that there was at the central level, there was an international body that was supposed to approve. And they list out that in the last, this is a 10-person body. In the last period, right at the end of the commitment period, this was a group that was dealing with something like 50 projects a day that they had to sign off on. So they were just approving everything. They had no capacity at the international level. And I think I'm spending a little bit of time on this because I think we can learn from this something about, I think everyone in this room would agree, oh, you should not have these perverse incentives. You should have an independent body. Well, they tried to do it under Kyoto Protocol and they sort of didn't manage. And so whatever we do needs to be better than that. And just as the CDM, this is the paper that came out in the Science that I talked about, is the one that basically used synthetic control methods to do this comparison, showed only 7% of these offsets were additional. And this is just some language from the article, right? So they talk about how there's flexibility in baseline methodologies that may have been exploited, and that projects struggle with on-the-ground implementation. And again, I think this comes to this question of how do you do institutional design. So what was the result of all of this? So the result of this is showing you the pricing of these nature-based projects in one of the indices that you can find. So if you look at the blue line is the one for nature-based projects or forest projects that we care about. And you can see at this peak, it was still low, but it was $15 per metric ton. It started crashing, and today is less than $5 per metric ton, the price of it. You can see all of them tended to crash. I think the only one that's not on this graph that's doing well is carbon sequestration projects. That has, I think, a price around $50 or $60, but this entire market has crashed. And what you see right now in this market is epitomized by kind of two trust problems. First, there's complete lack of trust that there are additional projects. So there's a belief that there is just low quality of credits. But importantly, I think there's a second problem also that we don't often pay so much attention to, is that I think a lot of, especially governments in the global south who are now responsible for jurisdiction provision of these projects, don't trust the global north's commitment to reduce emissions in the long run. So you hear a lot of this discussion that you want to keep doing very expensive, rich activities and just take away our chances of growth by buying up all our forests. So classic example of this is a Dubai-based company called Blue Carbon, which has bought up, I think, a very significant part of Zimbabwean land. And so, that's an idea that you're taking right now, poor Zimbabweans, paying them very low prices, but, prices they're willing to sell at. And that is going to allow you to just continue on an expensive lifestyle. And so I think whatever reforms we think of need to address both things. There's been a lot of discussion about how we need to address the issue of a lack of additionality. And I think less discussion on the fact that we also need to think about a mechanism that's going to raise the price adequately so that the global south or the farmers who are being asked to not farm can actually have a long-term sustainable alternative for their livelihood. And that's the problem of not having a compliance market. The problem of not having a compliance market, the prices are just not informative. The scarcity of the remaining emission space is not linked to the price. The price is right now just a bilateral trade between two people, depending on how much I want my net zero to be worth. And the current focus in a lot of, I'd say, the reforms, and I think one of the things I want to push is that we need to do much more than this, is just to improve governance principles. So for instance, one of the very well-known bodies is the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. And what it's doing is it's coming up with revised standards, and these revised standards are all great things. I think none of us are going to disagree with this. You want to have effective governance, you want to have transparency, third-party verification, additionality, no double counting, sustainable benefit and guards, and contribution. So these are principles I think none of us would disagree with. The question is, how are you going to operationalize it? And I think that's where right now there's a little bit of a lack of ambition in I think what's being proposed. And so really, I think the second part of the talk, what I want to argue about is that these principles in themselves are not going to be enough to either create trust or ensure that prices are informative. What we need instead is we certainly need credible measurement standards, but we also need a body that we have a mechanism to fund that is going to stand independently and do it. We want to not end up in the CDM Kyoto Protocol situation of having a 10-person international body that has no funds to really verify well at the end. And then finally, we also need that the pricing needs to reflect scarcity. So even if these offsets are going to allow the firms to individually reach net zero, that doesn't necessarily have a path to get to global net zero. So we need to think about a mechanism that's going to do more than just have individual net zeros. And so that's really what I want to talk about is what is it that we want to think about with the compliance market, which may have an independent associated with the independent measurement reporting and verification body. And as you'll see, I think the details of many of these things are still need to be worked out. So in some ways, this is also, to me, a bit of a call of arms to certainly my fellow economists to say, we spent a lot of time thinking about market design in many areas. There's been huge progress made, as we know, in kidneys, right? I mean, so Al Roth completely transformed how we could think about kidney transplants. Education markets have been transformed by market design principles, but actually very little of it has come to in the world of thinking about carbon markets right now. So what do I want to propose? So when I think about a compliance market, and as I said, don't think of it as something I have all the details right for right now, but I think this is the rough sense of where we want to go. You want to have an international compliance market which has at least two types of players: global north companies and global south project developers. The proportions of this, for instance, is something that we would need to work out. And then the way this market is going to work, you're going to have an emission cap. And that emission cap needs to, over time, be sufficiently binding so that certainly some of what the global north can benefit from is the cheaper emission cuts in the global south, which is something we talked about. But the global north will also face pressure over time to reduce its own emissions. And you're going to need that to have progress towards global climate goals. You want this market to have projects that are coming in sufficient thickness so that you're going to have information. And then this is going to, prices are then going to be valuable to the global north because they're going to be a verifiable reputation signal. And then I think an idea that actually Doug Diamond a long time ago brought up in the context of financial intermediation is you want to think about a model of delegated monitoring where actually the fees, some of the fees on the trades or the permit auctions are going to fund a centralized verification body. So if you think about the analogy you should think about is how do financial economists think about why banks exist? And the reason they argue, the reason that banks exist is that it's too expensive for one-to-one monitoring, right? So if I lend money to Barbara and then I have to spend all my time monitoring her, it's way too expensive a task for me to do. On the other hand, I can get the banks enter and I can delegate monitoring to them. I pay some fees to them, but they're the centralized body that then uses a lot of information and does. I think we need to think similarly. We need to bring those ideas of delegated monitoring in to start thinking about how do we actually, at the same time as having this market through which the trades happen, we have monitoring verification happen. So why a compliance market? Let me just remind you kind of the success in terms of prices and keeping it. So this is, sorry, I should have put the date. This is from, I think, 2022. So the EU ETS, which as I said is one of the most successful markets right now, has a carbon price of around $70 per ton. The UK ETS is a bit lower, but comparable. Standard errors move around enough, it's around $55 a ton. And then you start coming to, these are all different types of carbon offset market credits. And as I told you, the international carbon credit for nature products, on a good day, it might hit $10, but it's usually well below it. So we've seen now a lot of successful cap and trade markets. So these are markets that can work. By capping emissions, you're going to drive demand because it's going to be capped from the top. This is going to raise the prices to a level that can then fund true emission cuts. One important thing is that by doing this, it's going to also create within the market incentives for monitoring. But of course, in order to do that, you need to have a credible mechanism on the supply side that will ensure quality of projects. It's worth remembering right now that the EU ETS in its first phase did allow carbon offsets to come in. It did allow that to be part of the market. But then it sort of believed that the market price crashed in part because those credits were not of good quality. So in the current phase of EU ETS, and I think going ahead, this is going to be true, they have no space for things like nature-based projects. They want to completely be based on firms and industries and work with their, what they call scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So let me just spell out one more structure of why I think this is, You could say it's an interesting idea. It's certainly not a fully worked out idea at this point, but what are we proposing? At the heart of proposing this kind of climate market is to say we want to do two things. You want to reduce emissions, but you also want to think about climate justice. If you're going to bring through COP30, for instance, or any of the COP, any kind of market is going to require global south and global north. It cannot be one that makes the global south believe that they're just being used for the global north to continue on business as usual. So the kind of questions we're going to need is, first, what are the proportions? Another big issue that's come up is, should global south project developers only enter at the jurisdictional level? So right now, a lot of the concern is, for instance, people talk about in Amazon, about Amazon cowboys, that you go there, you go to indigenous populations, they don't realize quite what they're doing, and they're selling land at way too low a cost. So a country like Ghana, for instance, has announced that all carbon projects must be done only by the country, not by individuals. So I think that would be another question. But just to give you a sense of what's the difference between these two markets we're talking about. This blue dotted line could be slightly downward dotted because I think just naturally global north emissions are following. But what this is basically saying is that the concern with the existing offset market is that you're putting a lot of pressure to reduce global south emissions without much on global north emissions. In contrast, what a compliance market would do by adjusting the emission cap over time and by deciding how to distribute permits up front is actually put pressure on global north companies to also reduce their own emissions. So to not just rely on reduction in the global south. Just to be clear, the lines don't need to be linear. They could be concave in different forms. So what's the second part of the proposal? The second part of the proposal is to say that once you have the system up in place, we need to think about it just as in financial markets, people have thought about issues of delegated monitoring. So we need to have this verification and possibly risk mitigation body that exists. It's going to be a body that's going to try to ensure that the credits or permits reflect at least the claimed carbon emissions, carbon reductions, if not more. And so to talk about how this would happen, I want to actually turn now to a set of economics research papers, think a little bit about how kind of you could design plumbing in a market like this. I'm not going to talk a lot more about the design of the market per se, how you should choose what proportions. I think that's an open question, and I need market design people to collaborate with on that. But I think what I can talk about is some insights, and this is just a small set of insights that we've seen from development research that could be useful in doing what I think Esther has described as the plumbing of how do we actually start thinking about the elements of what this body would do. So first question, which is a very reasonable question to ask, is, can Global South institutions ever support participation in compliance markets? I think we spend so much time hearing about, corruption in low state capacity settings. You may be concerned that any market, international compliance market, that's talking about permits being sold in low income countries may be completely beset by all kinds of rent seeking. So I want to talk about just one piece of work that I've done with some colleagues, Nick Ryan, who's with me at Yale, Alan Sudarshan, who's at Warwick, and Michael Greenstone, who's at Chicago, which is really trying to ask the question, can you actually set up a pollution market in a lower income setting? So, the two concerns we always heard about is first is on monitoring. You may be very concerned that you will have complete fixing or monitoring taking place all the time, that when you have to calibrate machines to measure monitoring, people will just go in and fix them. And then second is that the regulator may not have enough credibility to ensure that there are permits held. So I may at the end of a period have polluted a lot, held very few permits, but then when you come and say you need to buy more permits, I just call up my friend in the government and they come and say there's no way you can ask the local state power company to hold permits on it. And so I think these are two genuine issues, and this is not to say that these are not issues that will not exist. But I think this is more a proof of concept that you can overcome them, and then the question just is where and how you can. So we worked with the government of Gujarat, but also the federal government in India to evaluate the world's first market for particulate matters. This took a long time. My colleague Nick Ryan made the mistake of, I guess, working with people who all had tenure at that point. He was a graduate student when he started, and it just got published well past his tenure log. So I don't necessarily recommend working with all of us as a graduate student. But we started by literally having to, in 2010, give the Indian government a white paper saying this is how a market would work. We then, Anant, my co-author, sat on he's also an engineer by training, sat on a committee that came up with what would be the standards for how we would measure particulate matter. And then in 2019, we started it. The market ran for 8 months, then COVID happened, so we shut down, but then we restarted again, and it's going now. And this graph tells you what you see. So don't look much till here. This is till Mach 2 is the period where we were installing devices. So period 1 is the first period of trading. This was implemented as a randomized control trial. So half the firms functioned under the kind of regulatory status quo system, which was to maintain a certain level of pollution. And in the treatment, all the plants had to together reach a certain cap and they could trade. And what we saw was that compliance was nearly perfect. We saw active trading at a single market clearing price, which was above the floor price in most periods, sometimes not. So for instance, just after COVID, there wasn't a lot of demand, so prices were not very high. But what's important to see is that right from the start, we actually see a large gap in compliance between treatment and control, and this persisted through the period. At the end of the first period, we actually had 2 plants who did not hold enough permits. And the government, the regulator came in very strongly and took away the bonds that they had to put in order to join the market. So managed to send a very strong signal of being a credible regulator. And so as a result, we saw this worked. And so I think, as I said, it's not to say that these problems won't exist, but I think if you can get governments and regulators to work, they do seem to be certainly the kind of countries, if you think about the big players, they're going to be Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, India. These are countries that have adequate state capacity to make it work and certainly have a set of projects. Maybe in DRC, there will need to be more work to be done, but I think, you can start with it. So now let me turn to the supply side and to ask, can we start kind of getting evidence on the kind of rules we would need to enable a credible international measurement, reporting, and verification system. So let me go back here, and this is actually the work we did prior to starting on the market, which was something that started actually quite by happenstance, which is the Gujarat government is one of the few states in India that actually has third-party auditing of waste polluted plants, and it requires firms to get auditors and report their emissions. And the reason we got involved was that actually the firms took the regulator to court saying that there was no evidence that this data was being used, and therefore they did not want to keep paying for it. The regulator responded that we're not using the data because we think it's fudged. And so the court very reasonably said, well, you either need to fix this or you need to end the scheme because there's no point spending this money on reports that you don't believe. Luckily for us, the court directive was along the lines of that you need to provide scientific evidence. And so they were willing to take the 2 years of doing a field experiment in order to get quantifiable evidence they could take back to the court. And so what this shows you here is this shows you the basic problem. So these are actually audit reports in the control firms that they were getting. The red line is the regulatory standard, and you can see there's huge stacking just under it. So a lot of people are just reporting under the regulatory standard. In contrast, what we did is we sent independent auditors in the 2-week window where we know that the data was being collected. And what you can see is that it's a lot more heterogeneous. And the problem, of course, with bad data collection is not only are there high emitters who are kind of being said to be under the line, But essentially, the market has so totally broken down that even clean guys were not showing up in the data. And knowing this fact for the regulator is exactly what opens up the possibility of having a pollution market, because you have a lot of heterogeneity in abatement costs. But the market had just completely collapsed. And in fact, the price you had to pay to get an audit was well below the lab cost. So it was just clear that people were taking a box. So what we did is we worked in again, the randomized control trial, and in the treatment areas, we provided the auditors financial independence. So the regulator kept a list of certified auditors, and then also a list of the payments, and then assigned auditors to firms, in this case, randomly. And then we did some monitoring. And what we found that the treatment auditors were 80% less likely to falsely report a compliance reading. So I think what that tells you is that this part of the problem can be actually solved quite easily to align incentives. But what it is going to need is this sort of independent, centralized body that is going to do this, being able to have enough resources to ensure that auditors are well verified and then paid over time. The second thing you want to ask is, showing additionality is very hard. And as I said, I think I alluded to this at the start, one reason some of the programs right now will say we will allow carbon sequestration, we'll allow reforestation and afforestation, but we won't allow deforestation because deforestation is particularly hard to show additionality in. And so, but in some ways, it's an important place to show effects on. So our first question you could start with, is there ever additionality on the kind of amounts of money that you're willing to pay? So a colleague of mine, Seema Jayachandran, who's in Princeton, had a very nice field experiment in Uganda where treatment households were given 70,000 Ugandan shillings per hectare to conserve the forest. It was again a randomized control trial. And what it shows, and then they use satellite data, which I think is an important source of data now showing up, to show a significant reduction in deforestation for the 2 years. Importantly, after 2 years, they ended the experiment, but they didn't have catch up. So what it meant is that while the treatment areas went back to being the same as control areas, that there was more deforestation when there was money being paid, they didn't try to catch up by deforesting even more than the controls. There was a permanent gain in terms of reduced deforestation. And there was also no evidence of leakage. And so I think experiments of these, you're not going to do them everywhere. This is certainly not what every company is going to do. But what you can do is you can use that to benchmark. You can say, well, in Uganda, 70,000 shillings can actually achieve additionality. That's the kind of ballpark we should be looking for in payment for ecosystem programs. So I think the way I think about a lot of these evaluations is that you have the sandbox of well-chosen evaluations that helps kind of calibrate some parameters of these programs. Similarly, I, with Seema and others, had a study in the context of crop burning in Punjab to ask, is it feasible to reduce crop burning by a payment for ecosystem, by paying individuals? And here we realized in field work that there were two problems by doing the typical model, which is to pay people conditional or not burning. Is that first, many of them would say they didn't have the liquidities, that they were burning was very cheap. To not burn, they had to get balers or other forms of crop removal, which is too expensive. And the second was just a complete lack of trust in the Punjab government. Not a belief that, you ask us to do so many things and you never pay us, why will you think we pay you for this? Now, from an economist's perspective, there is a dilemma. If you pay a lot of money upfront, why will anyone do anything, right? They have no incentive. There's not much money at the end. On the other hand, if you have these trust and liquidity problems, you probably want to pay upfront. So that's what we did. We varied that. And what we found is that actually the standard PS where you only pay afterwards had no effect compared to the place where we didn't pay anyone. 20% of farmers didn't burn. So 20% of farmers who, for whatever reason, don't burn, and that was unchanged. And that would have been the classic non-additionality with payment for ecosystems. But when we gave some of the money up front, and I think we didn't give a lot of money, I think that's why the numbers overall remain low, we did see a significant rise in lack of deforestation. And then the final study, which is from Brazil, I think one of the big promises that we're seeing come up in this area now is what's coming with advances in satellite imagery remote sensing. So, COP30 is going to be in Brazil. What's happening with the Amazon is going to be a critical part of the discussion there. DETER was a system which is a satellite-based surveillance system for deforestation. It was actually started during Lula's time period, then taken away, now it's come back. And what you see here is this is basically what they would do. They would use data to continually monitor changing color in satellite imagery. So the top image, that pixel set, is forest. And then in the bottom one, you can see that it's gotten deforested. What it did is that it used that to automate how monitoring would occur. So when you would see a sufficient change in color, you would actually send out the monitoring inspection teams, and they showed it reduced municipal deforestation by 25%, which is a large number. So again, I think this is an example of seeing how, if you had an independent body, I think we have a lot of promise now with things like independent satellite imagery to make progress in actually doing ex post verification. So let me start to summarize now. So, as I said, right now we are seeing a broad acceptance that the existing voluntary carbon market is not working. So I think that's not controversial. Most people agree on it. We see continued interest in nature-based projects. So, large players like Meta, Amazon, and others continue to want to invest in this market. But the way that we see reform happening in this market right now is there are a set of players who are essentially saying we come up with kind of tinkering with market rules on the corner. So a lot of discussion, for instance, on how to use satellite imagery, a lot of discussion on how to use ex post evaluations in this setting to adjust prices, but very limited discussion of how to actually change institutions. Similarly, Article 6.4 rules are being written out right now. The beginning has not been auspicious. They have grandfathered in a set of projects that were under the CDM, and those have involved a set of cook stove projects, which are widely believed to not be very good. And so I think all of those are important things that are going on, but a lot of my argument in this talk today is we're still tinkering on the margins. If we really want to make progress, we need to start really thinking about how to redesign institutions, and it's not something that has been done. I talked about things like education and kidney design where markets happen, but perhaps, we should just look at the financial architecture of the world today. Think of things like IS that determines so much of how banking works. We need to start taking much more seriously these institutions when it comes to climate. And that's, I think, to me, that reflects a little bit of the fact that economists are not that engaged with right now, or not being asked to the table that much to really think about how do you design the financial architecture of climate finance. And so I think, I think we need, if we can get compliance markets that work, I can't promise that they work, but I think we should start trying to figure out that it is one way that we can build trust. That's a great thing we've learned from international financial markets, that you can build trust. You can provide transfers for climate financing and a pathway to global emission reductions. I think, again, principles of delegated monitoring should apply in this context, which should allow for a centralized, independent MRV body. And if you can get credible MRV practices, and that's the one place where I do think the community is making progress. You could ensure project processes are informative and enable some amount of risk. Let me end with one graph. So what is this graph? This is a graph that shows you all the emissions trading programs across countries. So it starts with Australian ETS and how much of the country's industry is covered by it, Indonesian, and goes on so on. The red lines are countries that have a carbon tax. As I mentioned at the start, that is small, that has not been very effective. You can see here are all the pilots that have been taking place in China on emissions trading. What I want to highlight to you right now, there are really only two countries, the Republic of Korea emissions trading system and the Singaporean carbon registry, that actually allow carbon offsets or nature-based projects to enter the market. And really the concern has been that they are not high quality and they bring down prices. So for instance, in the Korean compliance market, it's only 5% of the market that can be non-Korean international trades. The light blue is slightly larger, like California allows domestic forestry projects, for instance, but not international. And so really, I feel like at a meta level, the question to ask is, there's a lot of hope right now being placed on compliance markets. I think it's expanding fast. It's going to continue to expand fast. And there has to be some discussion about how do we start thinking what Korea and Singapore is doing on a very small scale and expand it a bit more. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.